The views and opinions expressed in the following program do not necessarily reflect those of this station and/or Confederation College.
Alrighty, well, welcome once again to Spirit Canoe. My name is Bob Goujon, and we're going to travel the Spirit River waters once again. And on the program, a couple of things. We have a guest back again, Joy Asham, a writer. You've got a book coming out.
I have a book coming out in around Christmas or shortly after.
Okay,
Called
we'll have to get into that at
The
some point.
Truths My Father Told Me.
Right. In the meantime, of course, you still have your regular column with the
Yes.
Chronicle Journal,
Yep.
Anishtabeg Voice.
Mm-hmm.
So that we're going to have a bit of a chat here, just so the listeners know what's coming. We're going to chat for a little bit, and then the second half, both the college, university, and actually about 6 or more groups were involved in putting together a student orientation down at Marina Park last weekend, and I cycled down there with my camera and got some footage from that, which included a brief presentation by Stan Beardy, Regional Chief, Ontario Chief Stan Beardy, and the keynote speaker was Wob Canoe. So I've got portions of that on tape, and so that's going to be the latter half of the program. But for now, just to get ourselves started and warmed up, I thought we'd jump in with a little conversation, and since education is something of the theme of the second half, because it was a student orientation down at Marina Park. A year or so ago, I was teaching a course called History of Aboriginal Canadian Relations here at the college, and I guess at one point, most of the students were young, but there was a couple of who were a little older, and I had been mulling over for a while, the idea of two things, I guess, but the medicine wheel. I've been long interested in if you like, the power of the medicine wheel and its incorporation into Indigenous culture. On the one hand, it struck me as it's a story itself, but partly its role as a story is to gather other stories. It's as if people weave other stories into the medicine wheel. And what I mean by that is, I know, for example, there's a website called Four Directions, fourdirectionsteachings.com, I believe it is, and it's a series of kind of animated videos in a narration. And actually, someone from here, Lillian, I don't remember her last name, does the voiceover, and I guess for that. And she's talking, and actually there's there's different Indigenous groups, their Plains Indigenous peoples, is included in this. And I remember in the course of one of the presentations describing the building of a teepee, and how the building of the teepee and the various, if you like, the poles of the frame, when it was constructed, it would be constructed according to a plan that fit kind of into the medicine wheel as a story. And I guess there was a couple of things that really struck me there, was the manner in which, again, you would be telling stories woven into the medicine wheel as you're building the teepee, and this would be part of the teaching practice. And it kind of it struck me that while this is probably fairly typical, especially of an oral tradition, you don't have a library somewhere with a bunch of books. You're going to have to pass on anything that's important from one generation to the next, that is education, orally. You're going to have to tell stories, and you can imagine all the stories that need to be told. I mean, if you're thinking of a culture, I mean, we're at an educational institution, a college, but universities, and think of all the things that these educational institutions engage in, trying to decide, oh, this is important, this isn't, we need to pass this on if the kids are going to go do this or whatever, right? In an oral tradition, you're basically faced with the same problem. You've got to pass on information from generation to generation in a kind of coherent way, but orally. And so it seems likely that when you're engaged in certain activities, you're going to be telling certain stories. So you're telling certain stories when you're building the teepee. You're telling certain stories perhaps when you're building the canoe, all the other activities. So this is how I imagine. And so I had suggested in this one class that it struck me that, well, the medicine wheel was perhaps the education system for the oral tradition, because there is there is no library, right? So, and this one older fellow put up his hand, and I took this as encouragement. He's put up his hand. And he said, "I think you're right," and that this was just a kind of an affirmation that maybe I was on the right track. Not that I was right, but that I'd maybe glimpsed something here that maybe was on the right path. And so it kind of nurtured my curiosity even more, that to understand prior to colleges and universities and the arrival of the education systems that Europeans brought with them, there obviously had to be, within the oral tradition, ways of passing on information from generation to generation, because that's what education in a sense is. What are your thoughts?
Well, to begin with, I would like to give a little bit of a background. When Europeans came to North America, they saw that we were all the same color, and therefore we must all be the same culture. When people historically learn how many different languages there were in North America, like there's something like 156 in Canada alone, only 3 of which have any chance of surviving. But then you start to realize that Aboriginal people of North America were as different as had we gone the other way, we might have seen the Germans and the Spanish to be the same, or the French and the English, and of course they would dispute that. So where I come from in terms of the knowledge that I share comes from a place that is not necessarily homogenous, but what I learned back a long time ago. And so I go back far enough to know that the medicine wheel basically was a product of a book written by a fellow by the name of Hyamosius Storm. And basically what he did is he codified some of the teaching apparatus that we had. But I would also like to talk about the other teaching forms that we had, because I was always taught that there's a difference between father tongue and mother tongue. Mother tongue is the spoken language. Father tongue is the doing.
Right.
You mentioned teepee poles, for example. It used to be that when there was a teepee village on the plains, you could tell whether it was Dakota or Cree. And you could do that by the way that the teepee poles were laced at the top, the way the flaps were. And, of course, each teepee in turn identified an individual by normally they had their vision quest animal or representation painted on the hide of the teepee. So that when they're at night, when the lights were inside the teepee, you would see this amazing outline of this buffalo or this moose or whatever happened to be their particular totem. So, but in terms of us not having a written language, I also dispute that. And the reason I dispute that is because we did have counts related to such things as, okay, there was this massive storm this year and people died. Or there was this face-off between 2 different bands, or a territorial dispute, or this was the year that we saw the buffalo start to disappear, whatever it happened to be. So there were counts that annotated that. But there are other ways that we had of language being actually something that, to me, a written language is if I see a symbol or if I see a sign, which is, let's say, the letter A or the letter M, it immediately says something to me in my head and allows me to interpret. We had such things as, besides counts, we had lances. On the lance, you would find the colors that are significant to that individual, things that represented different aspects of their life that were significant in some way. Let's say they had their first successful hunt, and perhaps there's a bone from that hunt on the lance. The lance also showed such things as whether that person happened to be in honor within the community. If their lance was turned upside down, it meant that they were probably in a state of not so good grace. Perhaps they had scared a buffalo and destroyed the hunt, or something to that effect. Just as in terms of our punishment systems, they were such things as, like being turned away from the home for like 3 days, but then welcomed back with feasting, etc., a repatriation. So there's various ways of looking, I think, at language in a written form. And then when the Jesuits came and in turn attempted to write our languages in what they now call syllabics, those syllabics, if you look really closely, represent petals of flowers. The Dakota, for example, you usually use geometric shapes within their beadwork. You can tell from people's beadwork where they're from, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell by the kind of craft they do, what their location is. And this is another reflection on, like communicating through symbolism. So I'm not exactly sure that we weren't literate. And there's also different types of literacy. If I can just tell this
Yeah.
silly little story. Well, it's not a silly little story. First of all, I should say that the term priming pelts means when you get into the winter, when it starts to get colder, the fur on certain animals thickens and sometimes it even turns white. That's one of the terms that I'll be using in this story. I also called the person by name, the fellow that told me this story, and I call him by name because that is a sign of respect. And his name was David Nanwin. And apparently, David was quite well known for being able to predict weather. So these Caucasian people went to him at the beginning of a winter and said, "What kind of winter are we going to have?" And David said, "It's going to be a long, cold winter." And sure enough, it was. So the next year, they went back and they said, "How did you know it was going to be a long, cold winter?" And he said, "Well, the pelts were priming early, so I knew it was going to be a long, cold winter." Okay, so they said, "Well, what kind of winter is it going to be this year?" And he said, "It's going to be another long, cold winter." And sure enough, it was. So they came back and they said to him, "How did you know that?" And he said, "Well, the beaver are building their dams really thick." And sure enough, it was a long, cold winter. Again. So they came back and they said, "The first year you said it was because you knew that it would be a long, cold winter because the pelts were priming early. Second year, because the beaver were building their dams. What kind of winter are we going to have this year?" And he said, "It's going to be another long, cold winter." And they said, "Well, how would you know that?" And he said, "A white man I know cut an extra cord of wood." But that brings us back to the role of Aboriginal people that was given to us by the Creator, which is to be caretakers, stewards of the land around us and to know these things. And to me, the ability to be able to read the forest, to look to the sky and see where the eagle's nest is, to be able to know that the understory of the forest is just as important as, what's up here, then that to me is a literacy of sorts.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. Because if I can just jump in with that and kind of ask the question about that, awareness of the natural world and the relationships that you have with the other beings in the natural world, whether it's the beaver or the moose or it's a community of relationships. It's understood that way, and animals aren't simply resources; they're actually also brothers and sisters, and they're teachers.
You can see that in our languages too, like where now sometimes I have to, if I get a new editor, I have to pardon me for saying this, but do some retraining. Because what I tend to do is if it's a tree that is still living, I will call it by a proper name and I will capitalize that. That's because has a soul just like you and I. Wood in a table is set in a different way, and you don't capitalize it because that wood is dead. So the way that we look at language is entirely different. Also, literacy is something that just because you can speak and write in your own language, sometimes in Canada we still get labeled as illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
Just as they do sometimes with immigrants that come here. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't strive for literacy in what's called the lingua franca, in other words, the language of trade, and in this part of Canada it happens to be English. The most important thing to be able to do is communicate specifically to another person, whether that be on a paper full of words or whether that be, like through accuracy of choosing your vocabulary as you're speaking. But you also mentioned at the beginning, how do you pass these things on? I was taught that because a lot of things were carried orally, that the very most important thing was truth. And we were not to abridge anything. We were not to change it. We were to speak it as it was spoken to us. And what that meant is an accuracy in carrying down stories that sometimes gets lost within paperwork. You can hire all kinds of teams of lawyers like in the treaty disputes and stuff like that, because this one word might mean this, or it might mean that, or it might have shades of gray over here. But like if you're speaking in truth, same way as when the treaties were first signed, we didn't speak English. But when we first welcomed visitors to North America, at least in what is now known as Canada, we traded wampum belts. Wampum people think of as money, but it isn't. Mm-hmm. What it is the wampum belts that were originally traded had two lines of beadwork running parallel to each other. What this wampum was supposed to mean, these two lines, we are both gliding in our canoes down the river. And as long as you stay on your side of the river,
Right, that's right.
stay on mine,
yes,
and we don't intersect and cause
right.
problems with each other's lives,
right.
then and that was the purpose originally, was to say, you're welcome here as long as,
Yep.
you don't try to change us,
Right.
and we're not going to try to change you.
And we had sort of discussed that, Karen Drake and myself, in the first show that we did, and that this is, I described it as the principle of non-interference, and she concurred in that. And and the idea which we were discussing, because there's that wampum belt, the Truro wampum, but there's also the covenant chain, and that these, as I understand it, I tend to think of that these are two of the founding principles lying behind the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Europeans, which is the principle of non-interference on the one side, which is the Truro wampum, but the covenant chain is, but we also get together and do joint projects, so to speak. And in fact, the covenant chain was considered by many of the Indigenous peoples who were participated in the covenant chain was I was going to say legal, but really the sense of obligation that they felt that they were obliged to participate in the War of 1812, based on the covenant chain that they had signed or agreed to. That created a certain kind of relationship. And getting back to just the point you were making about literacy, that these wampum belts are part of a literate tradition of recording events in this case and recording relationships, and they are symbolic. They signify certain meaningful things in the world. And so in that sense, the culture has recorded in this particular form as significant as, if not more so, the written version of the treaties. Because one of the other things that Karen Drake and I got into was the idea that the written version of the treaty was not the actual agreement. The agreement was oral. And that the written treaties were something, a sidebar issue, which was not in fact agreed to because they weren't in fact signed, and so on and so forth. I won't rehearse all of that, but just that notion that that the wampum belt is a form of symbolic recording of culture, tradition, events, an accounting of in this case an agreement, and that's why Indigenous peoples bring out the wampum belts, just to sort of remind you. And I guess the other key thing is what the wampum belt signifies is that the agreement was done according to Indigenous protocol. In other words, the foundation of the agreement was, if you like to use a kind of glib language, which I can't from time to time, is the game was played according to Indigenous rules. It wasn't being played according to primarily, and this is kind of an after-the-fact interpretation, but at that time when these agreements were engaged in, there was ceremony, there was regalia, there was a symbolic material, if you like, in this case the wampum belts, which substantiated the agreement. And all those protocols were Indigenous. They were not European protocols, because the European protocols were simply, at that point in our history, not the relevant ones. Europeans adapted to Indigenous protocols for the first couple hundred years in a consistent basis, even in the fur trade.
You know, you can see that when you go up to, I spent some time on Baffin Island, and what really surprised me there is, yes, there's kind of like an apartheid process where the Inuit and others have kind of different social scales, work in different ways, that kind of thing. But rather than an area such as Thunder Bay, profound respect, because of the fact that the only way that people were allowed to survive on Baffin Island was by adopting some of those traditions and values of the Inuit. So even though there still is racism and you know, like difficulties between those two groups, they actually cooperate very well with one another around certain types of things. And as I said, chances of survival of non-Inuit people in places 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle is not good unless you rely on the traditional ways.
There's some events going on right now which I think would be kind of appropriate. I tend to watch the CBC a lot, and a lot of coverage on, I don't know if you caught it, but they now think they've discovered one of the ships, the Franklin expedition.
Oh, really?
Right. Yes.
Oh,
So they've been using the little sonar search pods or whatever they call them, and been scouring and scanning the sea floor, and I guess they'd found some artifacts on shore, and it was the Inuit who pointed this out, and according to the storytelling said, you should be looking over here, and that's in fact they found one of the ships on the bottom. Now, what's interesting to me is there is a debate that's still going on that why is the Franklin expedition important historically and contemporaneously? Why is it still important? Generally, the story seems to be, because the Canadian government and the current regime, Stephen Harper's regime, is very much involved with this project of finding. Now, there are issues of sovereignty in the north vis-a-vis other northern Arctic nations, Russia and so on. And so there's a bit of a competition going on for who's got the rights up there, right? So I gather that this is part of the idea of finding out the evidence regarding the Franklin expedition. But what strikes me as a bit odd, just going back to the point you were making, where did they end up? Well, on the ocean floor. They didn't know how to survive up there.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure, we're in charge. This all belongs to us. Why? Because we're here. We are dead on the sea floor, right?
I'm sorry, it's not funny.
No, well, it's not on the one hand, but there's an irony involved here that I think is worthy of some attention. And my point is, the Inuit are not considered typically, and I interviewed a fellow by the name of Michael Bliss who wrote a book called Who Owns the Arctic? And it's a discussion of sovereignty in the North, right? And there is well, his term in the interview that I recall, he used the phrase irrational hypocrisy to describe the relationship between the Canadian government, in this case the Inuit, right? The whole idea is that at Confederation there was this transfer of authority from the British to the Canadian government, and that's the basis of the Canadian government in Ottawa's claim to sovereignty in part up there. And so the Franklin expedition, as others, is considered part of this historical connection, and therefore the basis to some extent. And again, I'd like to get a few legal experts in here at some point to discuss the details of this. But the main point I'm trying to make is the Franklin expedition, which ends up on the bottom, precisely for the point you were making, they didn't know how to survive in this, right? They weren't the competent folks up there, but somehow or another they're supposed to be. I don't know how the imperialist link of drowning at the bottom of an ocean makes you the sovereign, I mean, the standard definition of sovereignty is supreme authority in a territory. Well, it's hard to claim to be the supreme authority in a territory when you're on the ocean bottom, you're drowned, and you're wrecked, you're shipwrecked. But and maybe just to finish up, sorry, just to finish up, why not make the claim of sovereignty based on the Inuit? They've been living up there for centuries. They're the competent form of civilization. They're the competent form of culture. And so why are they not the competent form of legal claim to sovereign authority? That would require, however, stepping outside the Indian Act, wouldn't it?
You know,
that's my take.
I have some certain theories, and let's talk about Mount Everest.
Yep.
Do you really think Hillary was the person to summit Mount Everest?
Yes, of course.
Of course not.
He wasn't the competent one.
And now, in relationship to the Franklin expedition, I guess there is a little bit of a contradiction there, because when Hillary planted the flag on top of Mount Everest, he didn't in turn claim that land. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
But somehow,
yes.
Within the growth of colonialism across the world, I mean, like, we have Tarzan. Tarzan can go into the jungle and, be a better jungle liver than, like the the black people that have been there since forever. So, like, there's all these, it is irrational.
Yeah.
These contradictions, if somebody really thinks it through,
that's right. Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
Rational hypocrisy was his phrase.
And, like, getting back to literacy for a minute, to me, literacy is the ability to identify and use common sense, whether that's in communication, whether that's in going through the forest and not getting lost, whether that's, living on Baffin Island.
Right.
So it's basic competency, like basic living competency.
And communicational competency in a place.
Yes.
That you can navigate your way successfully, reading the symbols and signs of the place you're in.
Exactly. And like they say, when in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
That never happened here.
Well, it did for the first few hundred, because they had to be taught. They only the first waves of Europeans only survived because indigenous people showed them how.
Indigenous people
showed them how to
harvest, how to like.
Absolutely.
Yes, I am aware of that. And you made an interesting remark. I forget whether it was in last show or not, or in passing. In our conversation, but that was the fact that for the first 200 years there weren't roads,
Well, right, yeah.
And to me, like that's a very significant part of my learning, what you shared with me at that point in time, because I'd always been trying to figure out what is the argument for Aboriginal people not having the wheel.
Exactly.
Because it didn't make any sense.
That's right. Made no sense whatsoever. Why would you bother?
Doesn't make sense unless you have roads.
Yes. So, as I said, the Europeans managed to forget the wheel for a couple hundred years there, because the rivers were just the more convenient mode of transport, and that's what they did. They used the canoe.
I'm wondering if I can digress into something, because like you kind of briefly touched on it, but
we have 1 minute.
Pardon?
1 minute.
1 minute.
Or 2 minutes. A couple of minutes.
Yeah. Okay. It's not quite long enough. What I was going to do is I was going to tell you a little bit of the the creation story that I was taught. I'm not saying it's the creation story from here,
Right.
but it's
Yes.
the creation story that
I'd
I
love
taught.
to hear it, but the
needs
footage,
more than 2
the
minutes.
footage, yeah, the footage for the is I think about 26 minutes. So I don't want to cut you off, and I don't want to cut it off.
But
and-
it explains, maybe at some point in time in the future we
yeah,
can do that.
absolutely.
Because it explains how Aboriginal people ended up being, or two-legged, period.
Mm-hmm.
Their major responsibility is stewardship of the land.
Mm-hmm. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've been listening. Excuse me. We've been listening to Joy Asham, a writer here in. Get it right this time. Last week I said Ottawa, in Thunder Bay for the Chronicle Journal. You have the Anishinaabeg Voice column, so hopefully people will.
And
Well,
generalist.
Yeah.
And generalist.
And generalist, and got a book coming out. So what?
Yes.
And you're going to have some writers coming in October.
Yes,
There's
in
a writer.
October, a couple of very famous, within the Aboriginal community,
Sure.
poets are coming in, and we're kind of hanging out in different places, chapters, Waverley Library, Blue Sky Lodge, having a number of little events to share one of the writers' works and our own works as well. So I'm really looking forward to that because it's not often I get a chance to actually sit down and talk with other Aboriginal writers.
Yes. Well, we'll have them here, hopefully. So, so we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we're going to be watching some footage that I took of the Matadese student orientation, and it's going to feature primarily a little talk, a couple of minutes by Regional Chief Stan Beardy, and then a little more from Wob Canoe, and it's pretty self-explanatory, so maybe we'll just take our break and jump to that. Thanks,
I wish
Joy.
all the students well and settling into
Yeah, that's
Thunder Bay
right.
and a
Yes. Yes.
good year.
The All Music Station, Confederation College Radio, plays hits and more like Blake Shelton's Footloose,
I'm punching my card.
Colt Ford's Chicken and Biscuits,
Kinda like chicken and biscuits.
Mohamme's Bumpy Ride, and Enrique Iglesias' Dirty Dancer. Music from the Pound, Confederation College Radio.
Alrighty, we're back, and we're about to watch some footage that I recorded, so be aware that it's amateur footage of the Matadese student orientation that a number of groups, college, university, and the city, and Oshki, and I don't have all the names of the groups that were involved in putting it together, which was primarily an orientation for students coming to these various institutions, especially those coming from out of town who are Aboriginal, coming from more remote communities, and just creating a welcoming space. So I just ran around with my camera and got some footage, which included a brief presentation by our Regional Ontario Chief Stan Beardy, and the keynote speaker is Wob Canoe. The only comment I'd make is that I took the footage at the very beginning and at the very end, and it actually was a lot more crowded than this. But anyways, here it is.
We will have a few short speeches, and I promise you they'll be short, so they'll require your attention. But first of all, I want to welcome you. Welcome everyone to Matadese 2014. Matadese is a joint Aboriginal post-secondary student orientation. Matadese in the Ojibwe language means he or she starts a journey. Your journey as students has started, and we hope that this year is an amazing year for you. 8 Thunder Bay organizations came together to bring you what we hope will be beneficial to you as a student here in Thunder Bay. I would next like to call up Ontario Regional Chief Stan Beardy.
Watcha. Stan Beardy, Nikas, what's going to make no chief? Watcha, now. I want to acknowledge the dignitaries on stage. I also thank them for being here. It's a beautiful day. I also acknowledge Chief from Fort William First Nation acknowledge the traditional lands of Portugal and First Nation people. Recently, Brian Maroney gave a speech, I think it was in Montreal. And during his speech to a business community, he indicated that the next biggest thing for Canada is its relationship with Aboriginal people. And it has to do with access to natural resources. It has to do with access to wealth creation. So it becomes very important if we want to continue to maintain strong prosperity and quality of life, that we have to work on that relationship between the main society and the First Nation people. But for us as First Nation people, right across Canada, the various leaders talk about self-government, we talk about self-determination, we talk about self-sufficiency, self-determination. And simply what that means is that the ability to do things ourselves. So this is where we are at today. This is why it becomes very important as First Nation people that we have young people that are trained, that are educated, so that we can be part of the global economy. Today, when we look at where we are at in Thunder Bay, the surrounding community, the Ring of Fire, tremendous opportunities. But if First Nation people don't have the education, if First Nation people don't have the training, if First Nation people do not have the know-how, everything will go right past us. So it becomes our responsibility when our leaders talk about self-determination. They're talking about our young people getting the education so that they can participate more meaningfully, more fully in the economy. So I encourage you, young people. I encourage you students that are going to school at various institutions here in Thunder Bay, whether it's high school, college, university, a law school, medical school, that you have to stay there. It is not good enough just to pass. It is not good enough just to go to school. You have to continue to strive higher learning and just keep going, because we have to have that if we are going to participate on the opportunities that are available to us. Stimulate.
Wob Canoe is a Canadian musician, broadcaster, and educator. Best known for his work with CBC Radio and CBC Television. He is originally from Anugaming First Nation. His hip-hop work has won an Aboriginal People's Choice Music Award. His journalism has won an Adrian Clarkson RTNDA Award, a Gabriel Award, and has been nominated for a Gemini Award. In 2012, the University of Winnipeg named Wob as its first Director of Indigenous Inclusion. Most recently, Wob has been appointed Associate Vice President for Indigenous Government and Community Affairs at the University of Winnipeg. Also contemplating a run for National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Wob is a leader, a role model, and a change maker. Please help me in welcoming Wob Canoe to the stage.
Hey, bonjour, and then when we talk, Obama quickly go. Quick, keep it as here as all we come in on this in the cause. Bonjour, and do them. The Kagi what the son they got big in the J. The Chiba Mateo. Negisa Gibas. Abache and Ziki and Dumpy Jaya, no ma, and then Maki with Poeton. The bonjour, and then them the Magana. Apache and Ziki and Dum in a woman done King. Wait, they got a bit what Nana Bonjour. No go to get it and then we change now big. abache ki ta Canoe amagozi yek mbino imagana onishin can we watch a wee and then in the line the kit or as we say in English hey how's it going you like that one there in the front row that was good. Well I figured maybe I'd start with a song and then I could do a little bit more talking on the issue at hand. But I figured, why don't we do what we do in the Native community whenever we want to celebrate somebody, and that is embarrass them. So why don't we ask all of our post-secondary students here today to stand up. Zadigo, Nibwick, stand up everybody. And let's all look at them and give them a big round of applause.
Oh, it's okay.
You guys look real good. Way to go. All right, the song was the melody to the song was composed by a young woman named Tiana Spotted Thunder, and she's from Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. She's Lakota, and the lyrics were some that I composed. Hey, oh, hey, yeah. Hey, oh, hi, oh, hey, yeah, hey, yeah, hey, hey, oh, hi, yeah, hey, oh, hi, oh, hey, yeah, hey, yeah, hey, well, hey, oh, hey, hey, oh, hi, oh, hey, well, oh, hi, oh, hey, well, oh, hey, oh, hey, on. What a bright, beautiful day! I like to show you how I love you, Yahweh. I look to the sky and see how the sunlight shines for you, Yahweh. How did Louis Riel become a Buffalo Soldier? Stood up to Canada, he's a father in Manitoba. How did Fontaine get the apology? He told the story, then he said, come on, follow me, that's the gift. I guess I'll pass it on like the teachings passed at the Sundance before dawn. How did Juanique take a knife to the ribs, then represent this country? Damn, she forgive. And how did Tommy Prince fight for Canadian people when right here at home he wasn't considered an equal? Overseas he fought with the heart of a warrior, then came back here to be treated like a foreigner. So yeah, I'ma live real lavish for all the time that they called our people savage. How did Kateri know that she should keep up the faith? They put the first native saint in the proper place. How did Buffy St. Marino to keep on singing? Bury my heart a wounded knee, it keeps on ringing. And how did Freddy Krueger know he had to stand up? Since I saw that photo, knew I had to man up. And how did Peguis know that he should help the white man? Did he understand that others would take his land? But damn, the worst is over now. The bro Adam Beach is on posters on the wall, and this is Big Wob. Still repping for Sab, though I'm up in Thunder Bay, I won't soon forget what the elders taught me. Always to share. My people don't want to be proud, well I don't care. Cause Tecumseh never sat at a bar getting wrecked, and Crazy Horse never cashed a government check. I said Tecumseh never sat at a bar getting wrecked, and Crazy Horse never cashed a government check. Well, thank you guys for listening to me. How are you guys doing today? Two people are doing really good, and everyone else is doing. Well, let me tell you guys look good, even if you don't feel good. I was looking over here, but I heard a lot of people over there, so that's good. My name is Canoe, and what I told you in Anishinaabemowin when I was saying hello is that my full name is Wabanakwit Kwikwe Kibana Sozao Bitang Canoe. Go ahead. Say it with me. When I was growing up in Onigaming in Treaty 3, everybody used to call me by my full name, Wabanakwit, right? But as soon as I moved to Winnipeg and started playing hockey, it got shortened real fast to Wab. You know, nobody wanted to be like, hey, pass it over here. So a lot of people wonder, like, even on the ride in, Cynthia, one of the great organizers, was asking me, so what does that mean? What is that name all about? And as you can imagine, like going to school in the city and going to work overseas and in the U.S., people are always like, huh? What? Wab? Rob? Do you mean to say Bob? No, it's Wab. So now you guys know Wabanakwit, Indigo. It means white cloud in Ojibwe. I come from a very beautiful community in Treaty 3 called Raven's Nest Portage, Kakagiwat-Sonigami. And on the Indian Affairs website, it's called the Ojibways of Onigaming First Nation. And it's a very wonderful place to grow up. I know when you watch the news and you see our communities depicted on television, there's like a very kind of standard way that they show our communities, right? It's like, okay, the news story starts with like a gravel road and a couple of kids walking by with dirty clothes on. And then there's a picture of a dog barking at the camera. Right? Standard res imagery. And like part of that stuff, I guess you could see in Onigaming when I was growing up, but it was also a beautiful, beautiful place to live, you know? As kids, we'd ride our bikes down to the lake every day, we'd go swimming, ride our bikes over to the baseball diamond, play baseball, then go fishing in the evening. And it was an amazing, ideal place to be a young boy. But how many of you have seen a community portrayed like that in the media? One of our communities. Like a positive portrayal. It's few and far between, right? And so that's why one of the big priorities in my career has been working in the media, first with CBC television here in Canada, and then internationally with Al Jazeera America, is to set the record straight about Anishinaabe people and Indigenous people in general. Because I know that we are very fun-loving, humorous, celebratory people who have a wealth of talent and knowledge to share with the world. And I find that, you know, now is a time that we need to move beyond the old stereotypes and the old discussions of the past and really step up and be what our ancestors wanted for us. And so that's what I really wanted to talk to you all about today, is to celebrate that spirit that is still alive within our peoples, and to encourage all of you who are in post-secondary to get your education, to engage in a process of lifelong learning. You know, get your certificate, get your degree, but then keep going after that. Get a professional degree, a law degree, a medical degree, an accounting designation. One of the frustrating things for me is working internationally, you know, and going down to Silicon Valley and seeing like the people who work at Google and things like that, and gaining an appreciation for how rich and how beautiful the world is today. But then sometimes I go back and talk to my own relatives, you know, and they're saying like, well, I'm not sure if I should go to high school or not. But it's like, no, yes, you absolutely have to go to high school. Then you have to go to university. Then you have to get a professional designation after that. And then after that, then you got to find a career that's going to make you happy, healthy, and successful. Often, people talk about the sleeping giant that's in the water here. But like as Anishinaabe people, we know the story behind that, right? It's Nanabuju, right? Nanabuju, our great folk hero. And for those who don't know, like, who Nanabuju is, it's like, imagine a native Jesus who was, like, not afraid to make a fool out of himself. A lot. That gives you an idea of roughly what Nanabuju is. And so our great folk hero, apparently long ago, during the coming of the Europeans, he lay down here, and he's been resting ever since. And I often ask myself, what would happen if he woke up today? What would he think if he looked around at his lands, at his people? What if he looked across his lands and he saw the tailings ponds, the highways going through the sacred sites, chemicals in the water, the Great Lakes? What would he think if he saw his great-great-grandchildren hanging themselves, medicating themselves with prescription drugs? What would he see if he saw that his people were the poorest of the poor in their own land? The young Anishinaabe kids go to schools on reserve. They get $4,000 less per student per year compared to provincial schools. What would Nanabuju think if he saw that there were more kids in the child welfare system today than were ever in the residential school system? What would he think if he saw that there were 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country since 1980? 1,200 stolen sisters, aunties, grandmas, nieces, daughters. Would he wake up? Or maybe that's why he's still sleeping. See, I think of stuff like that, and it's kind of a challenge. How are we going to get beyond that? How are we going to rise up and be the proud nations that we know we can be? And then I think about those who came before us, not as long ago as Nanabuju, but more recently. The song that I did there at the opening, I'm talking about heroes from the recent past. Chiefs like Peguis, war heroes like Tommy Prince, former National Chief Phil Fontaine, Olympian Juanique Horn Miller, people like that. I think about the sacrifices that they made to be where we are here today. And it inspires me to think of our elders. When we think a generation ago, what was the role of education to my father and his generation? What was the role of education to my grandma, to my grandpa? To them, education was the residential school era, the residential school system. And in the case of my late father, Tabasanakweti Bunt, he literally had to fight. He literally had to fight to hang on to his language and culture. It was the same experience for my aunties and uncles. They literally had to fight against adults in some cases. They had to endure many hardships. But for me, what they did was so important so that I can stand before you here today speaking Anishinaabe, that we can gather here together to celebrate our culture together and stand here as living proof that those who designed the residential school system failed. That those who designed the Indian Act failed in their mission to try and destroy our peoples, our languages, and our ways of life. And to me, that's a very powerful thing. That these little children were more powerful than the entire Canadian state, the entire government of Canada, and 5 churches levying their resources against them. It's a remarkable thing to think of what those young children did. And so when I ask myself, what can I do today? I immediately am forced to consider, well, did my old man ever give up when he couldn't see his mom and dad as a boy? Did my auntie give up when she was being punished for speaking her language? Did my uncles ever give up when they tried to run away from home and they were dragged back to that school? No, they did not give up. So who am I to throw away that legacy? Who am I to turn my back on the sacrifice that they made so that I could be here today? So where is our people today? Where are our people today? Well, I'll give you a snapshot of my family. My younger sister, Shawan, is also from Enigaming. Right now, she's finishing her PhD at Harvard University. Harvard University is ranked #1 in global surveys of the world's post-secondary institutions, right? And you know how much money the federal government has paid for education to date? Nothing. And it's not because programs like the post-secondary student support program don't exist. Absolutely they do. But the reason the federal government hasn't paid any money towards her post-secondary education is because she's there on a full academic scholarship. When she finished her undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto, she had Columbia University and Harvard University, 2 Ivy League institutions, in a bidding war to have her attend their graduate schools, right? So it's fair to say that my little sister is the brightest in her field at her age in the entire world. And she is an Anishinaabe. She came from a community just like yours. And she encountered the same things that you did growing up in this part of the world. So I raise her up as an example, as a role model, and I celebrate her. And I often do that when I'm visiting communities. You know, I like use her as this example and challenge young people. She did it, why can't you? Said to me, well, why didn't you? So I say, good point. Let's move on. So that's my younger sister. My older sister, Diane, she's a lawyer. She's a former Grand Chief of Treaty 3. My wife is a medical doctor. Her mom is a master's in education. Stepdad is a professional engineer. Myself, I'm university educated. I'm a senior executive at a medium-sized university. So you look at our family, right? PhDs, doctors, lawyers, engineers, master's degrees. You don't see that portrayed in the media. You don't see that on Arctic Air. You don't see that on North of 60. And yet that's increasingly the reality in First Nations, Métis, and Inuit families today. Because my family, we're not the only family like that. And so the role of education in our communities has changed. In one generation, education has gone from being the tool of oppression that was used to hold us down to becoming the tool of empowerment that we are using to lift ourselves up. And that's a remarkable thing. And all those students who stood up here just a few moments ago, you are part of that resurgence. You are part of that renaissance, that rebuilding of our nations, of us appropriating the tools of today to give back to our communities and strengthen them for tomorrow.
Alrighty, we were listening to, as you can see from the poster up there, the Matadese 2014 post-secondary student orientation that took place at Marina Park last weekend, and we heard an excerpt from Stan Beardy, Ontario Regional Chief, and then Wob Canoe, who provided, both of them actually, some powerful messages about education and the importance of it. And I also want to thank Joy Asham for coming in and speaking to us, and we're still working on what's going to happen next week, so we'll let you know as soon as we can. We do have another website. This is airing, if you're listening, of course you know it's on camptv.ca. There is another website where we're archiving these shows, spirit-canoe.ca. There is now a Facebook page for spirit-canoe.ca if you want to comment on anything you've seen here. So, and suggest any guests or topics that you'd like to see on the show in the future, so please contribute. My name is Bob Goujon. This has been Spirit Canoe. Thank you for tuning in to Hear Camp TV, coming to you from Confederation College here in Thunder Bay. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.